So in the video where I talked about the Bionicle Toa weapons and also talked about the Turaga weapons, I measured them essentially against four specific criteria: the weight of that weapon, the center of mass for that weapon, the range of that weapon, and of course the user which is wielding it, and what I call overhang. What is overhang? Again, to very briefly cover it in this video, it is just any area where the weapon recurves back downward, giving it the ability to latch onto the back of a mask and thus pull it off. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Toa Mata masks. I was going to look at all 12 masks, but this video would probably be like 30-45 minutes long, so we're going to try and cut this one in half. And also, there are some slightly different approaches between the two sets of masks overall. So, without further ado, the Toa Mata masks. In this video, I am measuring four criteria again, but these are more defensive criteria to a degree, and so I am measuring what I call flat, I'll talk about that in a moment, deflection, evasion, and hookability. As simple as that concept may sound, it is just how likely is a mask to receive that hook, right? So we'll talk about that once we get to it. First things first, what is flat? So when we look at the Bionicle sets from 2001, in context to the characters which are wielding their weapons, like Lewa here, and I'm going to use the McDonald's masks in this video. They're a little bit easier to see on this camera, but, just bear with me here. Gali's mask will be still her original mask, of course. What you need to consider is that there's not only a weapon being used, but there is the range of motion and how that weapon is used, right? In all cases with the Toa Mata, with maybe the exception of Pohatu, all Toa Mata are best when using a downward slice of their weapon, right? And so because of that, you have to think, okay, so if another character is going to be receiving the impact of that weapon, where are they likely to receive that impact? In the case of two Toa that are the same height, it's going to be roughly around the forehead area, assuming they're standing on level ground. Obviously, when kids are playing with these, they're going to hold them in their hands. They don't care about having them on the floor, and that's perfectly fine. But for testing purposes, we're going to assume that their feet never leave the ground, again, with the exception of Pohatu, because he kicks, one of his feet has to leave the ground, obviously. With that said, in the future, if you like this type of content, I will be doing a full-fledged testing of these. It's obviously going to be a much longer video than anything from this series has been, so let me know that one in the comments if you'd like to see a real, physical test. But with all that said, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. So, as I mentioned, flat is just the amount of area at the top of the mask that is susceptible to being hit, right? So essentially, if more of the mask is flat towards the top, like for example, the Matatu from Nuju, right? This mask has a very large flat area at the top of it. It's going to be more susceptible to that downward strike and just generally easier to hit because it's a larger surface. It's a bigger target to hit. So flat and evasion kind of play into each other, but they're slightly different. Evasion is a little bit hard for me to explain, mostly because the word I chose, but I think it makes the most sense. Evasion kind of takes into account the size of the mask and the shape of the mask, depending on sort of the area a strike is most likely to come from. So, when we look at a mask like this one, for example, this mask is quite large. It's easy to hit, but because of the shape of the mask being relatively smoothed from most sides and with fairly steep angles but pushed further forward, it's actually pretty good when it comes to evasion, because there's not a lot that you can hit here that doesn't immediately transfer that hit into a form of deflection, which means that the hit does not stop on impact but actually slides past the mask, so it doesn't deliver its full force. So evasion is also in a lot of ways tied to deflection. That all makes sense. Hopefully it makes sense to you as well. So when I look at a mask like Lewa's here, or I look at a mask like Tahu's, like the Akaku from Kopaka, and of course Gali's Cow, all of these masks have generally similar flat, what I would consider that, right? Some of them are slightly better and some of them are slightly worse in different ways. The Akaku, for example, is perfectly round at the top, meaning that it has pretty decent deflection. Not great, because just because something is round does not automatically attribute to deflection, but it essentially depends on sort of the angle at which the mask is likely to be approached, right? For example, if you took a knife, right? A knife has a sharp edge that comes together at a pretty steep angle. So if you were trying to hit that edge right on the sharp edge, right on the cutting edge, it'd be very difficult to do that without sliding off of one side or the other. So it will deflect that impact, right? The same is kind of true for this. If a weapon comes from the top here, it's likely to deliver its full force. And even if it gets into this area off of these sides, it's still likely to impact most of its force into this mask. It doesn't help that this mask has a little bit of a notch here that can easily grab weapons and remove any possible deflection coming from that side, right? So the deflection on this mask on first glance might seem really good. It's actually not. It's not great. But where the mask has its benefit is that it's a lot smaller than a lot of the other Toa masks. Well, I shouldn't say a lot smaller, but it's marginally smaller in areas that matter. This mask is reasonably easy to hit on one side thanks to the fact that it has these scopes here, but because of, again, the shape of those scopes, they can deflect quite easily, so it sort of balances itself out. The Akaku is a very weird mask to take a look at. Thankfully, though, it doesn't have a lot that you can hook onto. Yes, it has this area up here, but it actually pushes pretty far back on the head itself. So if I actually attach this mask, it fully covers up the little bit of gray plastic you can see inside of that eye stalk there, meaning it's a little bit harder to get behind that mask and actually hook onto it in the first place. And if we look at the mask from the side, any area where you might hook onto it from back here can again deflect and just mitigate whatever hook you might have. On first glance, you see these holes in the forehead and think those can be hooked into easily, but no, actually they can't, because none of the Toa Mata weapons are designed to hook into holes of that rough shape, right? That forward-facing thin line that goes across a mask, like this mask has, like the most of the masks actually have it. The Kakama has it at the top, right? The Hau has it at the top, and of course the Pakari is littered with holes at the top, but the angles on all of these masks, the way that they approach that design, means that it's not easy to actually hook masks in those areas. So it actually doesn't affect hookability that much, which is surprising, but it is kind of cool. So let's go ahead and take the Akaku off for a moment. Going back to the Miru here, this one is interesting to me, mostly because it has a very large forehead, right? This mask is most well known for the fact that it has a sort of beak, this overhang, meaning it sticks a little bit further forward than a lot of other masks. And on top of that, the curve here is really gradual. So although, as we deemed in a previous video, he has one of the best weapons with some of the best range of any of the other characters, he also has one of the weakest masks, unfortunately, because it's just a very large mask that's relatively easy to hit. And because it's not really interrupted, there's not a lot of angle changes, the deflection of a mask like this is relatively low. It is rounded, which helps that a little bit, but not as much as you think, as I explained here. And again, because the mask is also fairly wide at the top, the evasion is low. It does do okay when it comes to hookability. The mask does come up pretty far from the head itself here, so it's not like the best by any means, but it stretches back a little bit further than some of the other masks, which means that it can be a little bit harder to get back behind it and hook onto it to grab it. But if you do hook it, you have a pretty good chance of pulling the mask off, because it doesn't really have a good way of deflecting that hook until it gets to this point right here where that bend comes in, right? And even then, it doesn't do a great job. So it's definitely susceptible to being hooked onto. In terms of the flat, it's kind of middle of the road. But yeah, one of the weaker masks when it comes to actually being hit. So he's very offensive, but not very defensive. Someone also pointed out in a previous comment as well, talking about the arms of the characters and how you can use those for defense strategically. And he definitely has probably the worst defense in that regard too, because his arm is slightly shorter than other characters, though granted he does have longer fingers to make up for it, but this is a loose connection, remember. So if this is going to try to block an attack, it's not going to do a very good job because it's not going to absorb like any of that attack. But also, it's on a loose connection in the shoulder as well, meaning he basically can't even hold up his arm to try to deflect in the first place. So he's not great when it comes to defense if you want to consider limbs for defense. Going over to Tahu, he's kind of similar, actually, in a lot of ways to the Miru. That kind of makes sense because in a lot of ways, Tahu and Lewa are sort of seen as opposites. Obviously, Tahu and Kopaka are also seen as opposites, depending on like what aspect of the story you're looking at, right? But in this case here, he is a little bit worse on the flat perspective because this area up here is very flat. It's very susceptible to taking the full brunt of an impact, but he has slightly better deflection off of the sides here because the angle that changes here is a little more sharp than it is on the Miru. Not by much, it's minimal, but it is there and it is worth noting. It also doesn't stick up quite as high off the back of the mask, so you get slightly worse leverage for a mask like this. So I want to say evasion, but that's not even really the correct term for it. It's slightly better in those regards, is what I was going to get at. Also, the forehead here, though still very large, is a bit smaller than the Miru. So again, this can tank hits slightly better than the Miru, but not that much better. The Akaku is worse than this as well, but it is a little more evasive because of its small size. So again, it sort of balances out. And next, the Cow of these masks is probably the best between the Miru, the How, and the Akaku. Mostly because although it does go back pretty far on the head, meaning you get a little bit better leverage on it, it does have kind of a weird shape up here that makes it a little bit harder to grab onto for hooking, right? Also, there's a lot of areas on the sides of the mask that can help to deflect any sort of hook type attacks. And in this regard, you're basically only going to be fighting two other characters that are susceptible to, or that are capable of hooking anyway, unless you fight another Gali, I guess, right? The top of the mask here is slightly smaller than the others, so it is harder to hit. It's a smaller target, but it does have a little bit of a larger flat area towards the front here, thanks to the way that this is designed. So it doesn't tank the hits quite as well, but it's a little bit harder to hit than the masks we've looked at so far. This one's kind of middle of the road, but probably better than Lewa, Tahu, or Kopaka, or maybe roughly equal to Kopaka. In the case here, obviously, this character carries two weapons that wield both of them at the same times. So again, if you want to look at defensive capabilities with the offhand, it doesn't exist here. So Kopaka is better in that regard, if that's something you're playing into, right? Things really start to get interesting when we look at the Pakari and the Kakama. These two masks are actually similar in a lot of ways you may not expect. So the Pakari is actually a fairly large mask compared to the Kakama, which is one of the smaller masks from the wave. But interestingly, from the top of these masks, although they are different shapes, right? This is somewhat triangular. This is sort of octagonal or hexagonal when you're looking at it. What really counts is that top shape, right? There's very few opportunities that you're going to hit the chin of a character and actually knock a mask off. So if we ignore the chin half of this mask for just a couple of moments, then these two masks are actually shaped pretty similar, mostly triangular. And that's really good when it comes to deflection. Now, the Kakama, Pohatu's mask, is slightly worse at deflection because of a few things, right? First off, the flat area at the top of the mask here is larger than it is on the Pakari. So in that regard, it's a little bit of an easier target to hit. But also, although it has these steeper sides, which are better for deflection, it also has these little cheek protrusions here, which can catch that deflection. Meaning that even if something hits here, slides down the side, it's likely to hit here again and deliver sort of a second impact. It's going to absorb more of that attack, right? Whereas if a weapon comes in from the top here, it's much more likely to deflect off the side and it has nothing to catch on to. So this one is much better in regards of deflection and flat. The flat area here is the smallest of any of the Toa. However, this is the larger mask, one of the largest masks of any of the Toa. So although its deflection and its flat is good, and its evasion is decent because of that shape, the evasion is worse because of its size, right? In terms of hookability, this one is okay. Again, this is a fairly small area to hook onto up here, but because it tilts back like this, it actually makes it a little bit easier for weapons to get behind it and hook onto this. So this might actually be one of the worst masks when it comes to hooking. And on top of that, it doesn't go as far back as many of the other masks. You can see all of that gray plastic here is not covered up from the top down, meaning it has slightly better, rather, an incoming attack is slightly more likely to hit behind that mask. But this doesn't exist in a vacuum because Pohatu and Onua both have hunched neck approaches to their design, which means that their head is slightly further forward and slightly lower on their body. So instead of striking like this, the weapon has a slightly different advantage because it's going to strike with more of a downward impact. So although these masks are a bit smaller, a bit harder to hit, they are going to be hit harder, slightly, but it's still there, harder than other masks typically will. In the case of Pohatu, he does not have great defense because of the orientation of his shoulders here. You can sort of do something like this, which can help, and so you can kind of protect the mask from the sides, but it's not super. The interesting thing with Pohatu, though, as I've mentioned, is that he kicks, right? Which means that the point at which his weapon rotates is much lower than other characters. But I actually did testing yesterday, and even with his foot flat like this, not bent downward, extending his range, but even with it flat, he is still capable of delivering a downward strike on any of the Toa masks. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. So as I mentioned, the strengths of this weapon in a previous video are its mass. It is way heavier than any other weapon from the 2001 line. But unfortunately, it delivers that impact over a much larger surface that is entirely smooth. So it has no real way of hooking onto a mask when it delivers that downward strike, not to mention the angle at which it's going to do so. On first glance, it has these edges here that could hook, but you're really never going to approach an attack like this. In theory, you could angle the foot to the side, and that could help, right? But again, because of the angle of that downward strike, it's not as likely. You're going to hit areas like this on the side of the foot first, and that will deflect that hook, as you can see here. That's actually a big problem with Generation 2's weapon design, by the way, which I will talk about in a completely separate video in its own separate deep dive series. That's going to come quite a bit later. So this weapon is at its best when delivering sort of an upward strike or just using this as an impact, right? If I turn the entire weapon upside down and try to deliver a downward strike with it, suddenly it's a little bit better because look at all the textures that could potentially grip this mask, right? Like that right there, that actually hooks. Or this area here, which also hooks. So it's weird looking, obviously. It's not natural to bend your foot in that direction. I know some people that can, though. But yeah, it is possible. It's just not as likely. So with all of that said, hopefully this video gave you a kind of thorough understanding as to the approach of how I sort of test these masks. In conclusion, I would say that the weakest mask is probably the Miru. The other thing I didn't touch on with this mask specifically was hookability, and it is a little bit worse here just because the eye holes are quite a bit larger, meaning that something like Gali's hooks are actually able to get in here and grab onto the mask. Onua's claw is kind of the same thing too. It's difficult to do, but you can do it, and it's really like the only mask that's going to be susceptible to that compared to others. Other masks, you can look at the eye holes too, but the orientation of them or the size of them or sort of what they're hidden behind, like the eyebrows on, or the brow line on the How here, or the steep angles of the eyes on Pohatu's here, make it actually a bit harder to hit those points than something like the Miru where the eyes are farther forward. So yeah, crazy video series, I know. All right, so hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I know it's a long form one. I do apologize for the length of it, but if you guys are enjoying the series, I would really appreciate if you gave this video a like and subscribe. If you're already watching content like this on my channel, and if you've watched any of the other videos in the series, you'll probably like what's coming out next. And it's free, and it helps this little guy over on the internet. So it's all only good things. There's no negatives that come from it. Pretty cool. On top of that, though, you can also join the conversation down in the comments below, which also helps with the algorithm, but we can take that conversation further over on the Discord, Instagram, or Patreon if you want to help support the channel and videos like this. Those are all linked in the description. And yeah, I'm sure I overthought some of this stuff, but it's still really fun and it is true. So I mean, hey, I can't be overthinking that much. All right, I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.